Around 250 million years ago, Earth reached a point where nearly all land had come together into a single connected mass, not a loose arrangement of continents, but one structure that reshaped how the planet functioned. Distance from the ocean began to matter in ways it never had before. At the center of this supercontinent, moisture struggled to arrive. Some regions could pass through long stretches of time without meaningful rain, while temperatures shifted between intense heat and sudden cold. The air supported life, but not in the balance we are used to. Forests spread across parts of the land, yet they were built from forms that would not feel familiar. There was no grass underfoot, no flowering plants, and nothing resembling the ecosystems we move through today. The surface looked full, but its structure had changed. Insects moved across open ground that felt both active and incomplete. Early reptile like animals crossed distances that had no clear boundary, navigating a landscape that did not guide movement in the way modern environments do. Along the edges of the continent, conditions were different. Water returned, seasons held some consistency, and life concentrated into regions that could support it. Step away from those margins, and the system shifted again. Winds moved across the land in patterns that no longer exist. Entire regions operated under cycles that did not repeat in stable ways, shaping where life could remain and where it could not. Beneath the surface, slow processes continued to build. The oceans held complex ecosystems, but even there, the structure was not the same. Reef systems formed through organisms that would later disappear, and deeper waters were already beginning to change in ways that would not be visible from above. The planet appeared complete, but its internal balance was not. What processes allowed a single continuous landmass to reorganize planetary systems at a global scale? What unseen constraints determined where life could persist and where it could not? In this story, we look at how Earth functioned during the Permian Period as a single connected landmass and a system operating under different conditions. Before we step further, I'm always curious. Are you listening to this after a long day to fall asleep, or you are just listening purely for the knowledge? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy slow journeys through deep time, a like and a subscription keep these stories alive, and they mean more than you might think. Now, let's step back in time to the period when our planet was shaped by one continent. Long before any map could be drawn, the record of that distant world settled quietly into stone, layer by layer, as if the planet had been writing its own memory in slow motion. What remains today is not a single picture, but a vast archive, scattered across continents, waiting to be read with patience and care. Each exposed cliff, each buried fragment, carries traces of conditions that no longer exist, preserved not as stories, but as patterns of texture, chemistry, and form. In many places, ancient riverbeds hardened into rock still hold the shapes of currents that once moved through them. Fine sediments, pressed over time, reveal whether water once flowed gently or arrived in sudden surges. Grains of sand, sorted by wind or carried by floods, settle into arrangements that speak of dry interiors or shifting seasonal rains. Even the color of stone holds meaning, with deep reds often reflecting oxidation in open air, while darker layers suggest quieter, waterlogged conditions. These details gather into a language that describes landscapes long gone without ever needing to be seen directly. Within these layers, fossils appear not as isolated remains, but as participants in a larger system. Leaves pressed into shale reveal the structure of ancient forests, their shapes hinting at how plants managed heat and water. The distribution of roots in fossilized soil shows how deeply life had to reach to survive, sometimes spreading wide near the surface, sometimes descending into the ground in search of moisture. Bones and tracks add movement to the stillness, marking pathways across floodplains or pauses near ancient shorelines. Together, these traces form a network of relationships where environment and life reflect one another continuously. Beyond visible structures, a more subtle record is carried in the chemistry of the rocks themselves. Isotopes preserved within minerals shift in response to temperature and atmospheric composition at the time they formed. By measuring these variations, scientists can approximate the warmth of ancient seas or the balance of gases in the air. Ratios of oxygen isotopes, for instance, hold quiet evidence of evaporation and precipitation, allowing a reconstruction of climate patterns that once shaped entire regions. Carbon signatures reveal fluctuations in biological activity, marking periods of growth or decline across ecosystems. The arrangement of continents emerges through another layer of evidence written in the slow movement of Earth's crust. Magnetic minerals within solidified rock align with the planet's magnetic field at the moment of their formation. As continents drift over immense spans of time, these alignments shift, preserving a directional record that can be traced backward. When combined across multiple regions, they outline the gathering of land into a single mass, confirming that distant fragments of today were once joined in continuity. Ancient soils, often overlooked at first glance, provide some of the most intimate insights. Their structure reveals cycles of wetting and drying, while mineral content reflects the intensity of weathering under different climates. Cracks preserved in hardened ground suggest prolonged dryness, while layered deposits indicate repeated flooding. These soils carry the imprint of seasons, not as dates but as rhythms embedded in the earth itself. Taken together, these methods form a convergence rather than a single line of evidence. The Permian stands out because so many of these signals remain accessible and consistent across vast regions. Rocks, fossils, chemistry, and structure align with one another, allowing a reconstruction that feels less like speculation and more like a careful unfolding of what was always there, waiting beneath the surface. Seen from above, if such a view had ever been possible, the surface of the Earth during this time would not resolve into the familiar pattern of separated continents and open oceans, but into a single continuous expanse of land, its edges curving outward into surrounding seas that wrapped almost entirely around it. This immense structure, known as Pangaea, gathered nearly all terrestrial space into one connected form, stretching across latitudes and climates, binding together regions that today exist far apart. Its scale was not only a matter of size, but of consequence, as distance across this land began to shape conditions in ways no modern arrangement quite replicates. Along its margins, the boundary between land and water extended for extraordinary lengths, uninterrupted by the breaks and divisions that define present coastlines. These shores traced wide arcs where waves met the continent in long continuous contact, allowing ocean influence to reach inland with relative ease. Moisture traveled from these edges, carried by prevailing winds, feeding regions not far from the coast with seasonal rains and more stable conditions. In these areas, ecosystems found a certain continuity, supported by water cycles that, while still shifting, remained within patterns that life could follow. As one moved farther from these coastal zones, the presence of the ocean diminished gradually, then decisively. The vast interior of Pangaea lay beyond the easy reach of maritime influence, creating a separation not marked by visible boundaries, but by the absence of moderation. Without nearby bodies of water to regulate temperature, heat accumulated during the day and dissipated more completely at night, producing a rhythm of extremes that defined the interior environment. Rainfall, once carried inland by atmospheric currents, often lost its strength before reaching these central regions, leaving behind expanses where precipitation became infrequent and unpredictable. This growing distance from the ocean altered not only climate, but the structure of entire ecosystems. Plant life adapted to conserve water, spreading in patterns that reflected scarcity rather than abundance. Growth followed cycles tied closely to rare periods of moisture, with long intervals of stillness between them. Soil, shaped by limited organic input and reduced weathering, developed differently than in wetter regions, often remaining exposed and subject to wind. The ground itself became part of the system, its texture and composition influencing what could take root and what could endure. In contrast, the outer bands of the continent, closer to the surrounding seas, maintained more dynamic exchanges between land and water. Here, rivers carved their paths toward the coast, transporting sediments and nutrients that supported a wider range of life. Floodplains expanded and contracted with seasonal variation, creating habitats that shifted yet persisted over time. The difference between these regions and the interior was not abrupt, but it was profound, forming a gradient of conditions that extended across thousands of miles. Through this arrangement, Pangaea established a planetary pattern in which location determined experience with unusual precision. Proximity to the ocean became a defining factor, shaping rainfall, moderating temperature, and guiding the distribution of life. Far from the coasts, the land existed under a different set of constraints, where survival depended on enduring variability rather than stability. Across this single continent, the Earth expressed multiple environments at once, each connected by land, yet separated by the quiet influence of distance. Far from any shifting shoreline, the land settled into a stillness, shaped not by presence, but by absence, where the reach of the ocean faded until it no longer guided the air or the ground. In these interior stretches of Pangaea, distance became a defining force, quietly removing the moderating influence that water once carried inland. What remained was a landscape governed by imbalance, where moisture arrived rarely and often failed to linger, leaving behind conditions that stretched beyond what most modern deserts experience. The dryness here was not simply a matter of low rainfall, but of persistent atmospheric patterns that limited its arrival altogether. Winds, having released much of their moisture closer to the coasts, crossed vast distances with little left to give. Clouds formed less frequently, and when they did, they often passed without releasing significant precipitation. Over time, this absence shaped the ground itself, producing surfaces that remained exposed, shifting, and largely unbound by consistent vegetation. Evaporation exceeded what little rainfall occurred, reinforcing a cycle that favored aridity over recovery. In comparison to deserts that exist today, these regions extended with fewer interruptions and far less variation. Modern drylands often sit beside mountains, oceans, or seasonal systems that introduce periodic change, but the interior of Pangaea lay within a continuous expanse where such influences weakened. This allowed dryness to persist across enormous distances, creating environments where adaptation required not just endurance, but a reconfiguration of how life interacted with water and heat. The scale of these conditions gave them a kind of uniformity, yet subtle differences still emerged, guided by elevation, wind direction, and the slow movement of sediment. Evidence of these ancient deserts remains preserved in stone, where wind-shaped dunes hardened into layered formations that still reflect their original movement. The angled lines within these ossukur trace the direction of prevailing winds, capturing patterns that once shifted across open ground in steady, repetitive motion. Some formations rise in sweeping curves, while others appear more compact, indicating variations in wind strength and sediment supply. These structures are not random, but ordered records of a landscape in constant, dry motion, where grains of sand traveled across distances that felt without boundary. Plant life, limited by the scarcity of water, adopted forms that reduced exposure and conserved internal reserves. Growth remained low and spaced apart, with many species developing narrow leaves or protective coatings that slowed moisture loss. Root systems spread wide near the surface when rain was brief, capturing what little water reached the ground before it vanished. In longer dry periods, activity slowed, entering states of minimal function until conditions shifted again. The landscape, though not devoid of life, carried long stretches where movement and growth appeared paused, waiting for moments that arrived without regular rhythm. Animals within these regions followed patterns shaped by the same constraints. Many remained close to the ground or sought shelter beneath it, using burrows to escape both heat and exposure. Activity often shifted toward cooler intervals, when temperature extremes softened enough to allow movement across open terrain. Water conservation became essential, with physiological adaptations that reduced loss and allowed survival on limited intake. Rather than relying on abundance, life here persisted through careful balance, adjusting behavior and structure to match an environment that offered little margin for excess. Across these interior deserts, the land held a quiet continuity, shaped by distance and sustained by absence, where survival unfolded within boundaries defined not by visible edges, but by the steady withdrawal of water from the air itself. At the outer edges of that vast land, where stone met the slow rhythm of surrounding seas, conditions gathered into a different kind of balance, shaped by proximity rather than distance. Here, the presence of water did not disappear into the background, but remained an active partner, influencing air, ground, and the steady movement of life. Moisture arrived more reliably, carried inward by shifting winds that followed patterns tied to the turning of seasons, allowing certain regions to move between periods of growth and rest with a degree of consistency absent elsewhere. Rainfall near these coasts did not fall evenly throughout the year, but followed cycles that rose and receded, sometimes gently, sometimes with sudden intensity. Seasonal systems formed as temperature differences between land and ocean guided the flow of air, drawing moisture inland during warmer intervals and allowing drier conditions to return as the balance shifted again. These oscillations created a rhythm that shaped both landscape and life, where periods of abundance were followed by quieter intervals, each leaving traces in the soil and sediment that accumulated over time. Rivers emerged within this framework as pathways of continuity, linking inland regions to the sea through channels that carried water, minerals, and organic matter across long distances. Their courses shifted gradually, sometimes branching into wide floodplains where water spread outward before returning to a more confined flow. These floodplains became zones of renewal, where sediments settled into layered deposits that enriched the ground and supported dense clusters of plant life. The presence of water, even when temporary, allowed ecosystems to establish and persist, forming networks of interaction that extended outward from these flowing lines. Across different margins of the continent, variations appeared that reflected broader atmospheric patterns. On one side, prevailing winds carried moisture more directly from the ocean, sustaining longer wet periods and encouraging more continuous vegetation. On another, currents and wind directions reduced the amount of incoming moisture, creating coasts that, while still influenced by the sea, experienced more intermittent rainfall and sharper transitions between wet and dry phases. These differences did not divide the land abruptly, but shaped gradients where conditions shifted gradually, forming distinct ecological zones along the edges of the continent. The stability of these regions, relative to the interior, allowed life to leave behind a more complete record of its presence. Organisms living near rivers, lakes, and coastal plains were more likely to be buried by sediment during floods or gradual accumulation, preserving their forms within the layers that followed. Plant material settled into fine deposits, while animal remains became enclosed within sediments that hardened over time. This process, repeated across countless seasons, created sequences of preservation that captured moments of existence with remarkable clarity. In these coastal and wet regions, the interaction between water, land, and life formed a system where change remained constant yet traceable. Sediment built upon sediment, each layer reflecting conditions that had shifted slightly from the one before. The result is a record that endures not as isolated fragments, but as continuous sequences, allowing the outlines of entire environments to be reconstructed through careful observation. Along these margins, the planet expressed a quieter form of complexity, where stability and variation existed together, shaping landscapes that supported life while preserving its passage through time. Above this ancient landscape, the air formed a layer that was neither empty nor invisible in its influence, but a dynamic mixture whose balance shaped every surface it touched. The composition of the atmosphere during this time did not mirror the proportions familiar today, and even subtle shifts in its gases altered how energy moved between sky and ground. Oxygen levels, while still sufficient to support complex life, stood at values that gently adjusted how organisms processed each breath, influencing metabolism in ways that unfolded quietly across generations. Carbon dioxide, present in greater concentration than in the modern atmosphere, contributed to a broader retention of heat near the surface. This gas, interacting with incoming solar radiation, allowed warmth to linger longer after daylight passed, softening some transitions while intensifying others depending on local conditions. The balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide created an environment where respiration and temperature were linked through a shared medium, each responding to changes in the other without clear separation. The air itself became a participant in shaping how life moved, rested, and endured. Suspended within this atmosphere, fine particles from volcanic activity and windborne dust occasionally gathered into layers that altered the clarity of the sky. These particles did not always form a continuous veil, but at times they spread across regions, scattering sunlight and shifting its quality as it reached the ground. The light that passed through such a medium could appear diffused, its intensity softened in some moments, then returning with greater sharpness as conditions cleared. This interplay between clarity and haze created a sky that changed not only with time of day, but with the subtle presence of materials carried far above the surface. Sunlight itself, filtered through this atmospheric mixture, interacted with the land in ways that influenced both temperature and perception. The angle at which it arrived, combined with the composition of the air, determined how deeply it penetrated and how strongly it warmed exposed surfaces. In clearer intervals, light traveled with directness, illuminating the landscape with a brightness shaped by fewer obstructions. When particulate matter increased, that same light spread more evenly, reducing harsh contrasts and creating a softer illumination that extended across wider areas. The visual character of the sky under these conditions likely shifted between states that would not fully resemble those seen today. At times, it may have appeared expansive and clear, with colors defined by the scattering of shorter wavelengths. while at other moments, the presence of aerosols introduced muted tones that blended horizon and atmosphere more gradually. Subtle variations in gas composition could also influence the depth of color during sunrise and sunset, extending transitions that lingered longer before fading into night. Through all these changes, the atmosphere remained a continuous medium, connecting distant regions through currents that carried heat, moisture, and particles across the planet. Its composition was not static, but adjusted over time in response to geological and biological processes, creating a system that both shaped and responded to the world below. In this exchange, the sky was not merely a backdrop, but an active layer, holding within it the balance of gases and light that defined how the Permian Earth was experienced from moment to moment. Time moved across this world with a familiar rhythm, yet carried subtle differences that shaped each passing interval between light and darkness. The rotation of the planet was slightly faster than it is now, shortening the length of a full day by a small but measurable margin. This change did not alter the sequence of sunrise and sunset in any dramatic way, but it adjusted the pace at which energy arrived and departed, influencing how heat accumulated and dissipated over the surface. As daylight spread across the land, solar radiation reached the ground with a consistency defined by latitude and atmospheric clarity. In regions where the air remained relatively dry, sunlight encountered fewer bathai, allowing it to warm exposed surfaces efficiently. Without significant moisture in the air or soil to absorb and redistribute this energy, temperatures could rise steadily through the day, building toward peaks that reflected direct exposure rather than moderated exchange. The ground, composed of mineral surfaces and sparse vegetation, responded quickly to this input, heating in a manner that was both rapid and uneven depending on texture and composition. When the sun moved beyond the horizon, this accumulated warmth did not linger with the same persistence seen in more humid environments. The absence of water vapor, which in other settings helps retain heat, allowed thermal energy to escape more freely into the atmosphere and beyond. As a result, temperatures could fall at a comparable pace to their daytime rise, creating a pronounced contrast between the two phases of the daily cycle. This fluctuation was not uniform across all regions, but in the drier interiors it became a defining feature, shaping how organisms interacted with their surroundings. The transition between day and night unfolded gradually, yet carried a noticeable shift in both light and temperature. Twilight extended across the landscape as the angle of sunlight changed, softening the intensity of illumination before darkness settled more completely. During this interval, surfaces began to release stored heat, and the air responded in kind, cooling in layers that formed close to the ground. These changes created conditions that differed from both the full brightness of day and the deeper stillness of night, offering a brief period where extremes eased. Once darkness established itself, the environment entered a phase defined by reduced energy input and continued heat loss. The sky, influenced by the composition of the atmosphere, would have displayed patterns of light from distant celestial sources, though their clarity could vary with the presence of suspended particles. On the ground, cooler temperatures shaped activity, encouraging movement during intervals when conditions became more stable. Surfaces that had warmed significantly during the day now radiated energy outward, contributing to a steady decline in temperature that continued until the return of sunlight. In these cycles, the interplay between rotation, atmospheric composition, and surface conditions created a rhythm that extended beyond simple alternation. Each day carried the imprint of its environment, with variations in moisture, ground cover, and air composition influencing how energy moved through the system. The result was a sequence of transitions that, while consistent in structure, differed in experience depending on location, forming a pattern of time that was both predictable and shaped by the unique conditions of this ancient earth. Across the span of a year, change did not arrive as a gentle shift evenly shared across the land, but as a set of uneven rhythms shaped by the immense scale of the continent itself. The tilt of the planet still guided the cycle of light and darkness over longer intervals, yet the arrangement of land and sea altered how that energy translated into seasonal experience. With so much terrain gathered into one continuous mass, the pathways through which heat and moisture moved became extended and complex, creating patterns that differed from those known today. In regions closer to the center of this land, seasonal transitions carried a sharper contrast, not only in temperature but in the availability of moisture. Warmer intervals intensified the heating of the surface, drawing what little moisture existed upward and away, leaving behind prolonged dry phases that could stretch across significant portions of the year. When cooler periods followed, the reduction in solar input did not immediately restore balance, as the absence of nearby water limited the return of humidity. This created a cycle where each phase emphasized its own character, rather than blending smoothly into the next. Near the outer margins, where the influence of surrounding seas remained present, a different pattern emerged. Here, the shifting position of the sun across the year interacted with ocean temperatures, guiding large-scale movements of air that carried moisture inland during certain seasons. These movements resembled monsoon systems, where winds changed direction over time, bringing periods of increased rainfall followed by intervals of relative dryness. The arrival of these seasonal flows transformed the landscape temporarily, allowing rivers to swell and vegetation to respond in bursts of growth that aligned with the timing of these cycles. The contrast between these coastal systems and the interior remained gradual rather than abrupt, forming wide transitional zones where elements of both patterns could be observed. In these areas, rainfall might arrive irregularly, influenced by both distant oceanic processes and local atmospheric conditions. This variability introduced an additional layer of complexity, where ecosystems adapted not only to predictable changes, but also to fluctuations that did not follow a fixed schedule. Life within these shifting environments developed strategies that aligned closely with the rhythm of the seasons. In regions where wet periods arrived with some regularity, growth and reproduction often synchronized with the availability of water, allowing organisms to take advantage of favorable conditions before they receded. In more variable zones, flexibility became essential, with behaviors and life cycles adjusting to changes that could vary from one year to the next. Movement across the landscape, whether through migration or shorter range shifts, allowed animals to remain within environments that supported their needs as conditions evolved. Inland, where extremes defined the seasonal experience, survival depended on endurance and timing. Activity often concentrated during intervals when conditions were less severe, while other periods were marked by reduced movement and energy use. The ground itself reflected these cycles, with surfaces that alternated between phases of relative stability and periods of increased stress as temperature and moisture levels shifted. Through these patterns, the supercontinent shaped not only where life could exist, but how it moved through time. Seasons became more than a sequence of changes in temperature or rainfall, forming instead a framework that structured behavior, growth, and interaction across vast distances, linking distant regions through the shared influence of a planet arranged in a way that no longer exists. If one were to walk through these landscapes, the arrangement of vegetation would not resemble the layered fullness of modern forests, but a more open structure where space and growth were distributed with restraint. The ground would not be softened by grasses, nor marked by flowering plants, but instead held by a different assembly of life, shaped by conditions that favored endurance over abundance. The absence of familiar forms did not leave the land empty, but gave rise to forests that followed their own quiet logic, defined by resilience and adaptation. Among the most prominent of these were early conifers, their forms already carrying the outlines of trees that would persist into later ages. Their leaves, often narrow and structured to reduce surface exposure, limited the loss of moisture in environments where water could not be taken for granted. These trees stood with spacing that reflected the availability of resources, their roots extending into soils that varied in depth and composition depending on location. Nearby, seed ferns spread across the landscape, combining characteristics that allowed them to reproduce without reliance on freestanding water, a significant shift from earlier plant groups that required more consistent moisture. The absence of grasses altered the very texture of the ground. Without a continuous layer of low vegetation, the surface remained more exposed, with patches of growth separated by stretches of bare soil or scattered plant cover. This created a landscape where movement across the terrain followed a different rhythm, guided by clusters of vegetation rather than uninterrupted fields. The structure of these forests allowed light to reach the ground more directly, influencing what smaller plants could grow beneath the larger forms, and shaping a system where density varied from place to place. Compared to modern forests, these environments often appeared less crowded, yet they were not lacking in complexity. The spacing between plants created microenvironments where temperature and moisture could differ subtly over short distances. In some areas, clusters of trees formed denser stands, providing shade and slightly more stable conditions beneath their canopies. In others, the openness allowed for greater exposure, reinforcing the effects of heat and dryness. This variation produced a mosaic of habitats, each supporting different forms of life adapted to those specific conditions. Adaptation to limited water defined much of the structure and function of these plants. Leaves evolved shapes and coatings that reduced evaporation, while internal systems regulated the movement and storage of moisture. Growth cycles aligned with periods when water was more available, allowing plants to expand during favorable intervals and conserve resources when conditions shifted. Some developed deeper root systems capable of reaching subsurface moisture, while others relied on rapid absorption during brief wet periods, storing what they could for times of scarcity. These plant communities did more than occupy space. They shaped the ecosystems around them in fundamental ways. By stabilizing soil, they reduced the movement of sediments, allowing more structured environments to develop over time. Their presence influenced local climates, moderating conditions within their immediate surroundings and providing shelter for other forms of life. The distribution of vegetation guided where animals could feed, rest, and move, creating pathways and boundaries that reflected the underlying patterns of growth. In this world, forests were not defined by lush continuity, but by a balance between presence and absence, where each plant contributed to a system that functioned within the limits set by its environment, forming landscapes that were both sparse and intricately connected. A gradual shift began to appear in the structure of these landscapes, not as a sudden transformation, but as a quiet refinement in the way certain plants grew and endured. Among the varied forms already present, some lineages developed characteristics that would later become familiar, establishing patterns of growth that echoed through time. These early trees, bearing resemblance to modern conifers, introduced a more consistent vertical presence, their shapes defined by trunks that rose with measured strength and branches arranged to balance exposure and conservation. Their leaves, often reduced to needle-like forms or narrow scales, reflected an adaptation that limited the surface area through which moisture could escape. This change allowed them to persist in conditions where water remained uncertain, maintaining internal stability even as the surrounding environment shifted between dry intervals and brief periods of availability. The structure of these leaves also influenced how light was captured, spreading it across their surfaces without requiring the broader forms seen in other plant groups. In this way, they balanced the need for energy with the necessity of preserving resources. As these trees established themselves, their distribution extended across large portions of the supercontinent, following pathways shaped by climate and terrain. They appeared along transitional zones where conditions allowed for sustained growth, gradually expanding into areas that could support their particular requirements. Their presence did not create uniform forests, but rather networks of stands that connected across regions, forming a continuity that reflected both opportunity and limitation. Over time, these networks contributed to a more stable framework within which other forms of life could exist. Their suitability for dry conditions arose not only from their leaves, but from the systems that supported their growth beneath the surface. Root structures developed in ways that anchored them firmly while also seeking out moisture wherever it could be found. Some extended deeper into the ground, accessing reserves that lay beyond the reach of more shallow-rooted plants, while others spread laterally, capturing water from brief precipitation events before it dissipated. These strategies allowed them to maintain presence in environments where less adaptable species could not persist for long. The influence of these trees extended beyond their own survival, shaping the ground and atmosphere around them in subtle but lasting ways. By holding soil in place, their roots reduced the movement of loose material, allowing more stable surfaces to form over time. This stabilization influenced how water moved across the land, encouraging the development of more defined channels and reducing the extent of erosion in certain areas. As their remains accumulated, they contributed organic matter to the soil, gradually altering its composition and supporting the growth of additional plant life. In the spaces they occupied, these early trees created conditions that moderated extremes, offering shade and reducing direct exposure to sunlight. This allowed smaller plants to establish beneath them, forming layered systems that, while still less dense than modern forests, introduced a greater degree of complexity. The presence of these trees also influenced animal movement, providing structure within the landscape that guided pathways and offered shelter. Through their form and function, these early conifer-like plants marked a step toward more familiar ecosystems, not by replicating what would come later, but by establishing principles of resilience and structure that would persist, shaping the evolution of forests long after this ancient world had changed. Movement at the smallest scale often carried the most constant presence, unfolding close to the ground where subtle shifts in temperature and moisture shaped patterns that rarely paused. In this world, insects occupied that space with quiet persistence, forming a layer of activity that connected soil, plant life, and the air just above it. Their forms varied widely, from winged species that moved between patches of vegetation to ground-dwelling varieties that remained close to shelter. Each adapted to conditions that demanded efficiency rather than excess. Compared to earlier periods, when higher oxygen levels had supported insects of remarkable size, those living during this time followed a different trajectory. The atmosphere, now holding less of that gas, no longer favored extreme growth, leading to forms that, while still diverse, remained closer to proportions that balanced mobility and resource use. Wings retained their importance for dispersal, allowing individuals to move across distances in search of food or suitable conditions, yet their scale reflected the constraints imposed by the surrounding environment. Among these insects were early representatives of groups that would continue into later eras, including forms resembling beetles, dragonfly like species, and various primitive relatives of modern lineages. Their structures, though less specialized than those seen today, already displayed the beginnings of functions that would later define entire ecosystems. Mouthparts adapted to different feeding strategies, allowing some to consume plant material while others engaged in predation or scavenging. These variations created a network of interactions that linked insects not only to plants but also to each other. Without flowering plants, the role of insects in pollination differed from what would develop in later periods. Instead of bright blossoms and nectar driven exchanges, interactions often centered on more subtle processes where movement across plant surfaces contributed to the transfer of reproductive material. Seed ferns and other vegetation relied on mechanisms that did not require the same level of specialization, yet insects still played a part in shaping these interactions, influencing how plants reproduced and spread across the landscape. Climate exerted a steady influence on their behavior, guiding when and where activity could occur. In warmer intervals, metabolic processes accelerated, allowing for more frequent movement and feeding, while cooler periods encouraged reduced activity and conservation of energy. Moisture levels also shaped their distribution, with some species favoring areas where water remained available, while others adapted to drier conditions by minimizing loss and seeking shelter during more extreme phases of the daily cycle. The relationship between size and environment remained closely linked, as oxygen availability and temperature influenced how large these organisms could grow without compromising function. Smaller body sizes allowed for more efficient exchange of gases and reduced the demand for resources, aligning with conditions that did not support the larger forms of earlier times. This shift did not diminish their presence, but refined it, producing a balance between form and function that suited the world they inhabited. Across these landscapes, insects contributed to processes that extended beyond their individual lives. By feeding on plant material, they influenced patterns of growth and decay, while their movement helped distribute organic matter and nutrients through the soil. As both consumers and participants in broader cycles, they formed an essential layer within ecosystems that depended on continuity rather than prominence. In their quiet activity, these insects reflected the conditions of their time, adapting to an atmosphere and climate that shaped their scale, behavior, and role, integrating them into a system where even the smallest movements carried significance. A shift unfolded across the land in the way bodies met the environment, subtle at first, then increasingly decisive as certain forms began to move with less reliance on the presence of water. Among these, reptiles emerged with a set of characteristics that aligned closely with the conditions shaping the surface, allowing them to occupy spaces that had remained difficult for other groups. Their rise did not arrive as a sudden replacement, but as a gradual expansion, where advantages accumulated over time and translated into wider distribution. One of the most defining features of these animals lay in the nature of their skin, which reduced the continuous exchange of moisture with the surrounding air. This outer layer limited water loss, allowing them to remain active in regions where evaporation exceeded availability. In environments shaped by dryness, This trait alone altered the boundaries of where life could persist, enabling reptiles to move across terrain that offered little support for organisms dependent on constant hydration. Their bodies became more self contained, less exposed to the fluctuations that defined the land around them. Equally significant was the structure of their reproduction. The development of eggs capable of retaining moisture within protective coverings removed the necessity of returning to open water for the continuation of their lineage. Within these enclosed environments, embryos could develop with a degree of stability that had not been possible for many earlier vertebrates. This adaptation extended the reach of reproduction beyond rivers and wetlands, allowing life cycles to unfold entirely on land, even in areas where water appeared only briefly or not at all. With these changes, movement across the landscape gained a new continuity. Reptiles were no longer bound to specific locations for breeding, freeing them to explore and inhabit regions defined by different combinations of temperature and moisture. Their presence spread through transitional zones and into drier interiors, following pathways that had once remained sparsely occupied. Over time, this expansion formed a network of populations that connected distant parts of the continent, each adapting further to the conditions of its particular environment. Their physiology supported this expansion in ways that extended beyond skin and reproduction. Internal systems allowed for more efficient regulation of water and energy, enabling periods of reduced activity when conditions became less favorable, followed by renewed movement when opportunities arose. This flexibility aligned with the rhythms of the land, where extremes alternated with intervals of relative stability. By adjusting behavior rather than relying solely on constant external conditions, reptiles maintained a presence across a wide range of habitats. As they became more established, their interactions with the environment and with other organisms contributed to the shaping of ecosystems. Predation and competition introduced new dynamics, influencing how species distributed themselves and how resources were used. Herbivorous forms interacted with vegetation, affecting patterns of growth, while carnivorous species followed the movement of prey across varied terrain. These relationships added layers of complexity to systems that were already adapting to the broader constraints of climate and geography. Through these developments, reptiles came to occupy a central role within terrestrial environments, not by altering the fundamental nature of the world they inhabited, but by aligning closely with it. Their adaptations reflected the conditions of the time, allowing them to extend into regions where survival required a balance between independence and responsiveness, establishing a presence that would shape the course of life on land in the ages that followed. Among the varied forms moving across this landscape, there existed a group whose features did not fully align with those that would later dominate, yet carried within them the early outlines of something that had not yet emerged. These were the synapsids, a lineage that stood alongside reptiles but followed a distinct path, one defined not by separation from the land, but by a gradual refinement of how bodies functioned within it. Their presence added another layer to the developing complexity of life, one that would echo far beyond this period. Synapsids can be recognized by a structural difference in the skull, where a single opening behind each eye allowed for the attachment of stronger jaw muscles. This arrangement supported more effective feeding, enabling a wider range of diets and behaviors. Over time, this seemingly small variation became a foundation for further changes, influencing how these animals processed food and interacted with their environment. Their bodies, while still sharing traits with earlier vertebrates, began to shift toward proportions and movements that would later become more familiar. Among the most well-known of these forms was Dimetrodon, an animal whose elongated sail rose along its back, formed by extensions of the vertebrae. This structure likely played a role in regulating body temperature, interacting with sunlight and air to influence internal conditions. Other synapsids displayed different adaptations, some developing more compact builds, while others showed early changes in limb positioning that allowed for more efficient movement across the ground. These variations reflected an ongoing process, where form and function adjusted together in response to the demands of the environment. Despite sharing the land with reptiles, synapsids differed in ways that extended beyond skeletal structure. Their metabolism and physiology began to diverge, hinting at a shift toward more active internal regulation. While reptiles often relied on external conditions to guide their activity, synapsids showed early signs of maintaining more consistent internal states, allowing for movement across a broader range of temperatures. This difference, though not yet fully developed, marked an important step toward the later emergence of mammals. The evolution of these traits unfolded gradually, with no clear boundary separating one form from the next. Changes in teeth provided another indication of this progression as synapsids developed more specialized structures for processing food. Instead of uniform rows, their elasnan began to differentiate, allowing for more efficient breakdown of material before digestion. This adaptation supported higher energy demands and contributed to the shift toward more complex internal systems. As these animals spread across different regions, they occupied a range of ecological roles, from predators to herbivores, interacting with the same environments that shaped other forms of life. Their presence influenced patterns of movement and competition, adding depth to the networks already established across the land. In some areas, they became prominent components of the ecosystem, their adaptations allowing them to navigate conditions that varied across space and time. Through these developments, synapsids represented more than a single group within this ancient world. They embodied a direction of change, one that moved toward greater internal control and structural specialization. While they did not yet resemble the mammals that would appear much later, the foundations of that lineage were already forming, embedded within their anatomy and behavior, quietly shaping the course of evolution as the landscape around them continued to shift. In the broadest stretches where the land offered little relief, life arranged itself around scarcity, shaping behaviors that unfolded with careful precision rather than constant motion. Here, survival did not depend on abundance, but on timing, restraint, and the ability to remain within narrow limits set by heat and dryness. The surface, exposed for long intervals, carried conditions that shifted between intensity and stillness, and the animals that remained within it adapted by reducing their presence during the most demanding periods. Beneath this exposed ground, another layer of existence took form. Many animals moved downward rather than outward, creating burrows that extended into cooler, more stable conditions below the surface. These spaces, carved into soil or sand, provided protection from the fluctuations that defined the upper layers of the environment. Within them, temperature changed more slowly, and moisture, though still limited, persisted longer than it did above. The act of burrowing became not only a means of shelter, but a way of reshaping the immediate surroundings, producing microenvironments where life could continue with reduced exposure. Movement across the open terrain often aligned with the intervals when the intensity of the sun diminished. As daylight receded and the ground began to release stored heat, conditions shifted toward a narrow window of activity. During these periods, animals emerged from shelter to feed, travel, or interact, completing essential tasks before temperatures rose again. This pattern, repeated across cycles of light and darkness, created a rhythm in which presence on the surface was brief yet purposeful, followed by extended periods of retreat. Water in these regions existed more as a constraint than a resource, shaping physiology in ways that minimized loss and maximized retention. Many animals developed systems that allowed them to conserve internal moisture, reducing the need for frequent intake. Waste products became more concentrated, limiting the amount of water required for excretion, while skin and body coverings reduced evaporation. Some species obtained much of their required moisture from the food they consumed, drawing water from plant material or prey rather than relying on direct sources. The absence of consistent surface water also influenced how animals moved through their environment. Travel tended to follow paths where resources, however sparse, could be located with some reliability. These routes, shaped by memory and instinct, connected areas that provided temporary access to food or shelter, forming patterns that repeated over time. Movement was rarely random, instead guided by the need to balance energy use with the likelihood of finding what was required for survival. Even within these constraints, diversity persisted. Different species adopted variations of similar strategies, adjusting their behaviors to fit specific niches within the broader environment. Some remained almost entirely below ground, emerging only under particular conditions, while others spent more time at the surface, relying on speed or timing to navigate the risks. These differences allowed multiple forms of life to coexist within a landscape that offered limited opportunities. Across these desert regions, life unfolded with a quiet efficiency shaped by the constant negotiation between exposure and shelter, activity and stillness. The adaptations that emerged were not dramatic in appearance, but they carried a precision that matched the demands of the environment, allowing organisms to persist where conditions might otherwise seem too restrictive for sustained existence. Where water gathered and lingered, the land shifted into a different expression of life, one defined not by scarcity, but by cycles of renewal that unfolded along winding channels and open plains. Rivers traced their paths across the surface, sometimes narrow and contained, sometimes spreading outward into broad floodplains where their boundaries softened. In these regions, the presence of water introduced a continuity that allowed ecosystems to develop with greater density, supporting a range of organisms that depended on its steady, if variable, flow. Vegetation responded first, establishing layers of growth that followed the contours of the land and the movement of water. Plants with access to consistent moisture formed denser clusters, their roots anchored in soils enriched by sediment carried downstream. Leaves extended more freely, no longer constrained by the same degree of limitation found in drier regions, creating canopies that filtered light and moderated conditions beneath them. This structure provided both shelter and opportunity, allowing smaller forms of life to exist within spaces shaped by shade and humidity. Among these plants, a wide variety of animals found the resources necessary for sustained presence. Herbivorous species moved through these areas, feeding on abundant vegetation and following the shifting edges of water as seasons progressed. Their movement, in turn, influenced the distribution of plant life, shaping patterns of growth through grazing and trampling. Insects remained active within these environments as well, interacting with plants and contributing to the ongoing exchange of organic material between soil and surface. Predators followed these concentrations of life, their presence tied closely to the availability of prey. Movement within these ecosystems often reflected a balance between visibility and concealment, with animals using vegetation and terrain to navigate encounters that unfolded with quiet precision. Some relied on speed, others on patience, but all operated within a system where the distribution of water shaped the arrangement of life itself. These interactions formed a network of relationships that extended across the floodplains, connecting species through cycles of feeding and survival. The rivers themselves did not remain constant, shifting their course gradually over time or expanding beyond their banks during periods of increased flow. Seasonal flooding introduced a dynamic element where water spread across the plains, depositing layers of sediment that renewed the soil and altered the landscape. These events could reshape channels, create temporary bodies of water, and influence where plants and animals could persist. While such changes disrupted existing patterns, they also provided the conditions for new growth, reinforcing a cycle where disturbance and renewal remained closely linked. As the waters receded, they left behind traces of their passage, both in the arrangement of the land and in the distribution of life. Nutrients carried from upstream settled into the ground, supporting the next phase of growth, while organisms adapted to the shifting environment adjusted their movements accordingly. Some species took advantage of newly formed habitats, while others retreated to more stable areas until conditions aligned once again. Within these river systems and floodplains, the interaction between water, land, and life formed a continuous exchange, where each element influenced the others in ways that extended beyond immediate visibility. The result was an environment that, while subject to change, maintained a depth of complexity and connection, supporting a richness of life that stood in contrast to the more limited conditions found elsewhere across the continent. Beyond the margins of land, the surface opened into a continuous body of water that wrapped around the supercontinent, forming an ocean system shaped by different boundaries and flows than those of the present day. With most land gathered into a single mass, the pathways available for ocean circulation followed longer, less fragmented routes, allowing currents to move across wide distances without frequent interruption. This arrangement influenced how heat was distributed, creating patterns that reflected the interaction between solar input, planetary rotation, and the configuration of the continents. Surface waters, warmed by consistent exposure to sunlight near equatorial regions, moved gradually along these extended pathways, carrying thermal energy toward higher latitudes. Without the complex network of separate ocean basins that exists today, this transfer unfolded across a more unified system where differences in temperature developed over broader scales. In some regions, this allowed warmth to persist across larger areas, while in others, variations emerged more slowly, shaped by the balance between incoming energy and the movement of water itself. Beneath the surface, deeper layers responded to these conditions through circulation driven by density differences, influenced by temperature and salinity. Water that cooled or increased in density sank and moved along the ocean floor, creating a slow exchange between surface and depth. These movements, though not visible, formed an essential part of the system, redistributing nutrients and contributing to the structure of marine environments. Compared to modern oceans, where multiple basins and barriers shape these flows, the Permian seas operated within a more continuous framework, allowing for broader connections between distant regions. Marine life adapted to these conditions with a diversity that reflected both continuity and difference. Shallow waters near coastlines supported complex ecosystems where sunlight penetrated easily, allowing photosynthetic organisms to thrive. These areas became centers of activity, with various forms of life interacting within spaces defined by light, temperature, and nutrient availability. Reef systems existed, though their structure differed from those seen today, built by organisms that contributed to stable environments along the continental margins. In contrast, deeper ocean regions presented conditions shaped by reduced light and lower temperatures. Here, life adapted to an environment where energy arrived indirectly, often through the descent of organic material from above. Organisms developed forms suited to these conditions, relying on slower processes and specialized feeding strategies to persist within a setting that remained largely isolated from surface influences. The distinction between shallow and deep environments created layers of ecological variation, each supporting its own network of interactions. The overall biodiversity of the Permian oceans reflected a balance between established lineages and emerging forms, with many groups reaching levels of complexity that would later change significantly. The distribution of species followed gradients defined by depth, temperature, and proximity to land, creating patterns that extended across the ocean's vast expanse. While some environments supported dense concentrations of life, others remained more sparsely populated, shaped by the availability of resources and the conditions that governed each region. Across this continuous body of water, the movement of currents, the distribution of heat, and the presence of life formed a system that operated under its own set of relationships. The oceans were not separate from the land, but connected to it through exchanges of energy and material, contributing to a global environment where each component influenced the others in ways that unfolded gradually over time. Along certain stretches beneath shallow waters, structure rose from the seafloor in forms that were not shaped by a single kind of organism, but by layered contributions from many, each adding to a framework that grew slowly over time. These reefs did not resemble the branching corals that define many modern systems, but instead formed through the accumulation of varied builders, including sponges, algae, and other calcifying life that work together to create solid, expanding foundations. Their surfaces developed as living mosaics, where growth occurred in patches that gradually merged into continuous formations. Among the most significant contributors were sponge-like organisms known as spongiomorphs, along with calcareous algae that produced rigid structures capable of withstanding constant interaction with moving water. These organisms did not construct reefs through delicate branching forms, but through more compact and interlocking shapes, producing frameworks that appeared dense and uneven. Over time, layers accumulated as generations of organisms grew, died, and were replaced, leaving behind mineralized remains that became part of the reef itself. The difference between these reefs and those of the present day extended beyond their builders to the overall arrangement of life within them. Modern coral reefs often display a high degree of vertical complexity, with intricate branching structures that create numerous spaces for organisms to inhabit. In contrast, Permian reefs tended to form broader, more massive structures with fewer fine-scale cavities, shaping habitats that supported life in different ways. The surfaces provided stability and shelter, but the internal spaces were arranged according to the growth patterns of the organisms involved, leading to environments that were less fragmented yet still diverse. Within these reef systems, a range of marine life found support and opportunity. Organisms attached themselves to the surfaces, while others moved through the spaces between structures, feeding on materials carried by currents. The reefs influenced water flow, slowing it in certain areas and allowing nutrients to settle, creating localized conditions that supported increased biological activity. This interaction between structure and movement contributed to the development of ecosystems that extended beyond the reefs themselves, linking them to surrounding waters through continuous exchange. The uniqueness of these reefs lay in the combination of organisms that formed them and the conditions under which they developed. The balance of ocean chemistry, temperature, and available species during this period allowed these particular builders to dominate, creating systems that would not persist in the same form later in Earth's history. As environmental conditions changed and as different groups of organisms rose to prominence, the nature of reef construction shifted, leading to the coral-dominated systems that would emerge in subsequent eras. What remains of these ancient reefs is preserved within rock, where their structures can still be traced in cross-section, revealing the layered accumulation that once existed beneath shallow seas. These records show not only the physical form of the reefs, but also the sequence of growth and change that occurred over time, capturing a system that was both stable and dynamic within its own context. In these formations, the interaction of multiple life forms created a foundation that supported entire communities, shaping the surrounding environment in ways that extended far beyond their immediate boundaries. They stand as a distinct chapter in the history of marine ecosystems, defined by builders and conditions that belonged to this time alone. Within these waters, life took on forms that do not align neatly with those seen today, shaped by evolutionary paths that would later narrow or disappear entirely. Movement through the ocean did not follow a single pattern, but unfolded across many layers, where organisms occupied distinct depths and roles. Each adapted to conditions that shifted gradually from surface to seafloor. The result was a community composed of both familiar lineages and others that now exist only in the record left behind. Among the more recognizable inhabitants were brachiopods, whose paired shells opened and closed along a different axis than those of modern clams. They anchored themselves to the substrate, filtering particles from the surrounding water, contributing to a steady circulation of nutrients within shallow marine environments. Nearby, crinoids extended their feathery arms into passing currents, capturing suspended material and adding a gentle motion to the sea floor. These organisms formed part of a broader assemblage that relied on the constant movement of water to sustain itself. Alongside them lived ammonoids, relatives of later cephalopods, whose coiled shells housed soft bodies capable of controlled movement through the water column. Their presence introduced a dynamic element as they navigated between depths, feeding and avoiding predation within a space that offered both opportunity and risk. Trilobites, though already in decline compared to earlier periods, still persisted in some regions, their segmented forms moving across the seabed in search of food. Beyond these groups, there existed forms that do not have direct modern counterparts, organisms whose structures reflect evolutionary experiments that would not continue into later eras. Some reef-associated species combined characteristics in ways that blur clear classification, while certain sponges and microbial communities constructed frameworks unlike those found today. These life forms contributed to ecological roles that would later be filled by different organisms, marking a stage in the ongoing reorganization of marine ecosystems. The importance of these species lies not only in their presence, but in how they represent transitional stages within broader evolutionary processes. Traits that would later define more familiar groups appeared in early forms, refined over time through gradual change. The interactions between species, whether through feeding, competition, or coexistence, shaped pathways that influenced which lineages would persist and which would fade. In this sense, the Permian oceans served as both a continuation of earlier developments and a foundation for what would follow. Within these ecosystems, relationships formed through the movement of energy and material across different levels. Filter feeders drew sustenance from suspended particles, while mobile organisms consumed smaller forms or scavenged remains that settled below. Predation introduced selective pressures that influenced behavior and structure, encouraging adaptations that enhanced survival within a complex and interconnected system. Each interaction contributed to a balance that, while constantly shifting, maintained continuity across the ocean's vast expanse. The distribution of these organisms followed patterns shaped by depth, temperature, and proximity to nutrient sources, creating zones where certain species thrived while others remained absent. In shallower areas, diversity often increased, supported by greater access to sunlight and more active circulation, while deeper regions fostered specialized communities adapted to lower energy conditions. Through these varied forms and interactions, marine life during this time expressed a richness that extended beyond simple categorization, reflecting a world where evolution explored multiple directions at once, leaving behind traces of possibilities that no longer remain in the living oceans of today. Far beneath the visible surface, motion continued at a pace too slow to witness directly, yet powerful enough to reshape the arrangement of the entire planet over vast spans of time. The land that appeared fixed and continuous was, in reality, the upper expression of deeper forces, where sections of Earth's crust moved gradually across the more fluid layers below. These movements did not occur in isolation, but as part of a system in which pressure, heat, and density differences guided the direction and speed of change. During this period, the configuration of the continents reflected a long process of convergence, where separate landmasses had been drawn together through the steady motion of tectonic plates. As these plates approached one another, the boundaries between them became zones of compression, where the crust thickened and folded. Mountain ranges rose along these kathut, not suddenly, but through repeated episodes of uplift and deformation that accumulated over millions of years. These elevated regions marked the meeting points of continents that had once been distant, now joined into a single, continuous form. The merging of these landmasses into Pangaea was driven by the balance between forces pulling plates apart in some regions and pushing them together in others. Mid-ocean ridges, where new crust formed and spread outward, contributed to the movement of plates across the surface, while subduction zones, where one plate descended beneath another, allowed older crust to be recycled into the interior. Over time, these processes guided continents along paths that eventually brought them into contact, creating a configuration where nearly all land existed as one connected unit. This arrangement influenced not only the shape of the land, but also the distribution of geological activity. Regions where plates continued to interact remained sites of ongoing change, with volcanic activity and seismic movement reflecting the release of energy stored within the crust. Magma, rising from deeper layers, reached the surface in certain areas, contributing to the formation of volcanic landscapes that added complexity to the terrain. These processes operated alongside the slower deformation of rock, shaping the surface through both gradual and episodic events. The impact of this tectonic configuration extended beyond the immediate period, establishing patterns that would influence the planet long after the supercontinent began to break apart. The positions of ancient mountain ranges, the distribution of rock types, and the alignment of structural features all carried forward into later geological history, forming the foundation upon which future changes would occur. Even as the continents eventually separated, the legacy of their earlier union remained embedded within the structure of the crust. The movement of plates also affected the circulation of heat within the planet, influencing volcanic activity and the release of gases into the atmosphere. These interactions between the interior and the surface contributed to broader environmental conditions, linking geological processes with climate and the distribution of life. Though these connections unfolded slowly, they formed part of a continuous system where changes in one domain influenced others over extended periods. Through these ongoing movements, the Earth maintained a dynamic equilibrium where stability existed not as permanence, but as a temporary balance within a larger process of transformation. The formation of Pangaea represented one phase within this cycle, shaped by forces that operated beyond immediate perception, yet left their imprint on every aspect of the planet's structure. At scattered points across the land, the surface opened in ways that revealed the heat held deep within the planet, where molten material rose slowly through fractures in the crust and found its way upward. These regions did not dominate the entire landscape, yet their presence marked areas where internal processes became visible, leaving traces that would persist long after the eruptions themselves had ended. Layers of volcanic rock, preserved within the geological record, indicate episodes where lava spread across the ground, cooling into formations that captured the movement of liquid stone as it solidified. In some areas, repeated eruptions built up sequences of flows that accumulated over time, creating thick deposits that altered the local terrain. These formations did not appear suddenly, but developed through cycles of activity separated by intervals of relative quiet. Ash settled over surrounding regions, sometimes carried far from its source, forming fine layers that later hardened into stone. These deposits, now embedded within the stratigraphic record, reveal not only the occurrence of volcanic events, but also their frequency and distribution across different parts of the continent. The influence of these volcanic regions extended beyond the immediate eruption sites, shaping nearby environments through both direct and indirect effects. Freshly formed surfaces, composed of solidified lava or ash, created new ground where life could eventually establish itself, though initial conditions often remained harsh. Over time, weathering processes broke down these materials, contributing minerals to the soil and altering its composition. In certain cases, this led to localized areas where plant growth could take hold more readily, forming pockets of development within broader landscapes. At the same time, volcanic activity released gases into the atmosphere, adding to the existing mixture that defined conditions at the surface. Carbon dioxide, along with other gases, entered the air during eruptions, contributing to shifts in atmospheric composition that could influence temperature and chemical balance. These emissions did not always occur in a continuous manner, but even intermittent releases had the potential to accumulate effects over extended periods. The interaction between volcanic output and atmospheric processes formed a connection between deep Earth activity and surface conditions. Evidence suggests that these volcanic processes, while part of the normal functioning of the planet, may have begun to intensify toward the later stages of the period. Patterns observed in rock sequences indicate an increase in the scale or frequency of eruptions in certain regions, pointing to a gradual shift in the balance of internal forces. This change did not manifest as a single event, but as a series of developments that hinted at a broader reorganization occurring beneath the surface. These early signs of instability were not immediately apparent within the everyday experience of the environment, yet they formed part of a larger pattern that would eventually influence global conditions. The release of gases, the alteration of landscapes, and the shifting dynamics of the crust all contributed to a system in transition, where processes that had operated steadily began to show variations in intensity and distribution. Within this context, volcanic activity represented both continuity and change, a reminder that the surface of the planet remained connected to deeper forces that operated beyond direct observation. The traces left behind in rock and atmosphere reveal a world where internal energy found expression in ways that shaped the land, the air, and the conditions under which life continued to adapt. Across the full span of this united land, climate unfolded as a broad gradient rather than a uniform condition, shaped by latitude, elevation, and the immense scale of the continent itself. Temperature did not settle into a single pattern, but varied across distance in ways that reflected how energy from the sun was received and redistributed. Near the equatorial regions, solar input remained more direct and sustained, allowing warmth to accumulate steadily over time, while farther toward the poles, the angle of incoming light reduced its intensity, creating cooler environments that followed a different rhythm. This variation in temperature was not confined to simple bands, but interacted with the arrangement of land to produce distinct zones that extended across large areas. The interior regions, far removed from moderating influences, experienced conditions shaped by extremes, where heat could build during warmer intervals and dissipate more fully during cooler phases. In contrast, areas closer to the outer edges of the continent, influenced by surrounding seas, maintained a more moderated range, where fluctuations occurred within narrower limits. These differences formed a pattern where location determined not only temperature but also the consistency with which it changed. Between the equator and the poles, transitional zones emerged, each carrying characteristics influenced by both position and geography. In some regions, seasonal contrasts became more pronounced as shifts in solar exposure interacted with the distribution of land and water. These areas did not follow a single predictable pattern, but instead displayed a range of conditions shaped by the interaction of multiple factors, including elevation and the movement of air across the surface. Wind systems developed as a response to these temperature differences, driven by the need to balance variations in atmospheric pressure. Warm air rising in equatorial regions set in motion large-scale circulation patterns, drawing cooler air from higher latitudes and creating continuous movement across the planet. As this air traveled over the extensive landmass, it carried heat and, in some cases, limited moisture, redistributing energy in ways that connected distant regions. The absence of multiple separate continents allowed these systems to extend over longer distances, influencing conditions across wide expanses without frequent interruption. The direction and strength of these winds varied depending on position, shaped by the rotation of the planet and the contours of the land below. In certain areas, consistent wind patterns established pathways that repeated over long periods, while in others, variability introduced shifts that altered local conditions. These movements influenced not only temperature, but also the distribution of moisture, determining where rainfall could occur and where dryness would persist. Geography played a central role in shaping these climate zones, with mountain ranges, plateaus, and lowlands all contributing to the flow of air and the retention or loss of heat. Elevated regions could alter wind patterns, redirecting movement and creating areas of differing conditions on either side. Low-lying areas allowed for more direct passage of air, facilitating the spread of climatic influences across broader regions. The overall arrangement of the continent, combined with these features, produced a system where climate was not static, but continuously shaped by the interaction of land, air, and energy. Through this interconnected system, the planet expressed a range of environments that coexisted within a single configuration, each defined by its position and the pathways through which heat and air moved across the surface. At the far reaches of this ancient world, where the angle of sunlight lowered and stretched across long distances, the surface carried traces of a colder past that had not entirely vanished. In earlier intervals of the Permian, ice had spread across portions of these polar regions, leaving behind marks in the rock that still record its presence. Striations etched into stone, formed by the slow movement of glaciers, and deposits of unsorted sediment reveal a time when frozen masses advanced and retreated, shaping the ground through persistent pressure and gradual flow. These colder conditions did not remain fixed. Over time, a transition unfolded, shifting the balance toward warmer climates that reduced the extent of ice and altered the character of these high-latitude environments. The change did not occur abruptly, but through a sequence of adjustments in temperature and atmospheric composition that allowed ice to recede and exposed land to reemerge. As glaciers withdrew, they left behind surfaces that bore the imprint of their passage, creating landscapes marked by uneven terrain and deposits that reflected their earlier presence. With the retreat of ice, opportunities for life expanded into areas that had once been more restricted. Vegetation began to establish itself in regions where conditions allowed, forming communities adapted to cooler temperatures and shorter periods of growth. These plants did not resemble those of lower latitudes, but carried forms suited to limited warmth and variable light. Their presence introduced new interactions between soil, air, and living systems, gradually transforming the environment from one dominated by ice to one capable of supporting sustained biological activity. Animals followed these changes, occupying niches that developed as the landscape shifted. Life near the poles did not reach the same density found in more temperate regions, yet it persisted through adaptations that aligned with the unique conditions of these areas. Movement and activity often followed the availability of resources, which in turn depended on the seasonal cycles of light and temperature. These organisms adjusted their behavior to match the rhythms imposed by their location, maintaining a presence in environments defined by variation rather than stability. The pattern of light across the year introduced one of the most distinct features of polar regions. As the planet's axis remained tilted, periods of extended daylight alternated with intervals of prolonged darkness, creating cycles that differed significantly from those closer to the equator. During times when the sun remained above the horizon for longer durations, the surface received continuous illumination, allowing for growth and activity that extended beyond the limits of shorter days. When darkness returned, these processes slowed, and life adapted by conserving energy and reducing movement until conditions shifted once more. Temperature, while moderated compared to earlier glacial phases, still reflected the influence of latitude, remaining lower than in other parts of the continent. This created an environment where change unfolded gradually, guided by the interplay between solar input and atmospheric conditions. The absence of large ice sheets in later periods did not eliminate the memory of colder times, which remained embedded in the structure of the land and the distribution of life. Through these transitions, the polar regions of the Permian illustrate a landscape in motion, where past conditions lingered within the present, and where life adjusted to a sequence of changes that reshaped both the ground and the cycles of light that defined each passing year. Sound did not fill this world in a constant stream, but emerged in intervals, carried by air and shaped by the surfaces it moved across, forming a shifting presence that reflected the character of each place. In open regions where vegetation stood apart and the ground lay exposed, wind became the most persistent voice, moving across the land in long, unbroken currents. As it passed over uneven terrain, it gathered subtle variations in tone, rising and falling depending on the contours it encountered, creating a continuous low movement that stretched across distance without interruption. Where loose sediment lay at the surface, the motion of air lifted fine particles and guided them along, producing a faint, granular texture within the sound itself. In some moments, this movement remained soft and steady, while in others it intensified, carrying a sharper edge as grains collided and shifted across the ground. The absence of dense vegetation allowed these sounds to travel farther, unimpeded by barriers that might otherwise absorb or scatter them, giving the landscape a sense of openness not only in sight but in sound. Near water, the character of the environment changed, and with it, the quality of what could be heard. Rivers moving across the land produced a range of tones shaped by their speed and the surfaces they passed over. In narrower channels, water flowed with a more directed motion, creating a steady, rhythmic sound as it moved around bends and over uneven ground. Where the flow spread into broader areas, the sound softened, becoming more diffuse as it interacted with sediments and vegetation along its edges. These variations formed a pattern that shifted with the movement of water itself, reflecting changes in depth and flow over time. Along the margins of the ocean, the interaction between water and land introduced another layer of sound. Waves, driven by distant winds and local conditions, met the shore with a repeated motion that carried both continuity and variation. Each contact produced a subtle change, shaped by the angle of approach and the structure of the coastline, creating a sequence that unfolded without exact repetition. The movement of water in these regions did not remain constant, but adjusted with shifts in wind and tide, altering the rhythm and intensity of its presence. Among these broader elements, the sounds produced by living organisms added moments of activity that appeared and faded within the larger environment. Insects contributed a fine, intermittent layer, their movements and interactions creating brief pulses that rose above the background before dissolving again. Larger animals produced calls that served specific functions, whether marking territory, signaling to others, or responding to nearby activity. These sounds did not dominate the landscape, but appeared as isolated events, each carrying information within its structure. Interactions between animals introduced additional variation, as movement through vegetation or across the ground generated subtle disturbances. Footsteps, shifts in position, and brief encounters all contributed to a pattern of sound that remained closely tied to behavior and environment. These elements did not persist continuously, but formed part of a broader sequence where stillness and motion alternated. Across this world, sound followed the same principles that shaped all other aspects of the environment, emerging from the interaction between air, surface, and life, forming a presence that was neither constant nor absent, but carried quietly through each moment as part of the larger rhythm of the planet. Close to the surface, where contact with the environment was immediate and constant, the world revealed itself through textures and traces carried in the air, subtle yet persistent, forming an atmosphere that differed in character from what is familiar today. The dryness that defined much of the land did not remain an abstract condition, but took form in the way the air moved and settled, often carrying fine particles that lingered and shifted with each change in wind. Dust became part of the environment's presence, suspended briefly before returning to the ground, coating surfaces in layers that reflected the absence of sustained moisture. This dryness influenced not only what could be seen, but what could be sensed through contact. The ground, lacking the softness that continuous vegetation might provide, presented a firmer, more granular texture, where movement across it produced subtle shifts beneath each step. In some areas, the surface held together in compacted layers, while in others it remained loose, responding to pressure with slight displacement. These variations created a landscape that could be read through touch as much as through sight, each region carrying its own pattern shaped by local conditions. Where vegetation existed, it introduced another dimension, though one that differed from the layered sense associated with modern forests. Without flowering plants, the chemical profile of these environments followed a different composition, defined by resins, oils, and other compounds released by conifers and seed ferns. These scents did not spread with the same intensity or variety found in later ecosystems, but formed a more restrained presence, emerging most clearly during warmer intervals when heat encouraged their release into the surrounding air. The result was an atmosphere marked by subtle aromatic qualities, consistent yet distinct in their character. In regions influenced by geological activity, additional elements entered this sensory landscape. Gases released from volcanic processes introduced compounds that altered the air locally, sometimes detectable through their interaction with the environment. These emissions did not remain constant, but appeared in association with specific areas, contributing to conditions that differed from the broader surroundings. Their presence added complexity, blending with natural atmospheric components to create localized variations that could be experienced through proximity. The interaction between air and surface extended beyond scent, shaping how the environment felt in a more immediate sense. Dry conditions allowed for greater variation in temperature across short distances, influencing how the ground and air interacted at different times of day. Surfaces exposed to prolonged sunlight retained heat differently than those in shaded or sheltered areas, creating contrasts that could be perceived through direct contact. These differences, though subtle, contributed to a sensory landscape where variation existed within even small changes in position. Compared to the present, the overall experience of these environments would have carried a distinct quality, shaped by the absence of certain elements and the prominence of others. The lack of flowering vegetation, the presence of fine airborne particles, and the influence of geological activity combined to form an atmosphere that reflected the conditions of its time. Each component contributed to a system where the senses engaged with the environment in ways that, while grounded in familiar processes, unfolded within a context that no longer exists in the same form. Through these textures and traces, the Permian world expressed itself not only through visible structures, but through the subtle interplay of air, surface, and composition, creating an environment that could be experienced through continuous, quiet contact. Across this world, adaptation did not emerge as a single response, but as a quiet accumulation of changes, each one shaped by the demands of an environment that rarely offered consistency. Life adjusted not by resisting these conditions, but by aligning with them, allowing structure and behavior to shift in ways that supported continued existence. Over long spans of time, these adjustments became embedded within the forms of organisms, guiding how they interacted with heat, dryness, and the shifting availability of resources. In many species, the body itself became a record of these changes. Surfaces evolved to limit the exchange of moisture, reducing loss in regions where water remained scarce. Internal systems adapted to store and regulate essential resources, allowing for longer intervals between intake and use. Limbs and posture shifted to improve movement across varied terrain, supporting efficiency rather than speed, and conserving energy in environments where expenditure carried greater risk. These structural changes did not appear abruptly, but developed gradually, refined through repeated cycles of survival and reproduction. Behavior complemented these physical adaptations, forming patterns that aligned activity with favorable conditions. Movement often occurred during intervals when environmental extremes softened, while periods of intensity were met with reduced exposure. Shelter, whether beneath the ground or within natural formations, provided stability during less favorable phases, allowing organisms to maintain balance despite external variability. These behaviors were not random, but shaped by consistent pressures, creating rhythms that repeated across generations. Diet and feeding strategies also reflected the constraints of the environment. Some species adapted to consume a wider range of available resources, increasing flexibility in times of scarcity. Others specialized, developing mechanisms that allowed them to extract nutrients efficiently from specific sources. This diversity of approaches reduced direct competition and allowed multiple forms of life to occupy overlapping spaces without exhausting the same resources. The balance between generalization and specialization became another axis along which adaptation unfolded. Physiological processes adjusted in parallel, influencing how organisms managed energy, temperature, and internal stability. Metabolic rates aligned with external conditions, rising during periods of activity and lowering when conservation became necessary. Water retention mechanisms improved, allowing for survival in regions where direct access remained limited. Reproductive strategies evolved to match environmental cycles, ensuring that development occurred during intervals most likely to support growth and continuation. Over time, these combined adaptations contributed to a broader resilience that extended across ecosystems. Rather than relying on a single set of conditions, life developed the capacity to persist through variation, adjusting to shifts that occurred over both short and long timescales. This resilience did not eliminate vulnerability, but it allowed systems to recover and reorganize, maintaining continuity even as individual components changed. The result was a landscape where life did not simply endure, but integrated itself into the patterns of the environment, forming relationships that reflected both constraint and opportunity. Each adaptation, whether structural or behavioral, contributed to a network of interactions that supported persistence across a range of conditions. Through this ongoing process, life demonstrated a capacity for adjustment that matched the complexity of the world it inhabited, shaping its presence within an environment defined by extremes. Energy moved through this world in quiet sequences, passing from one form to another without pause, shaping relationships that connected even the most distant parts of the landscape. At the foundation of these systems, plant life gathered and transformed sunlight into stored energy, anchoring entire networks that depended on this initial exchange. Though vegetation often appeared spaced and restrained, its presence carried significance far beyond its visible extent, supporting layers of interaction that extended outward through every environment. Herbivorous animals formed the next link in this flow, feeding on available plant material and converting it into movement, growth, and reproduction. Their activity followed patterns influenced by both resource availability and environmental conditions, guiding where energy accumulated and where it diminished. In regions where vegetation was more concentrated, these animals moved with greater continuity, while in more limited areas, their presence became more intermittent, shaped by the need to balance intake with expenditure. Predators emerged within this structure not as dominant forces, but as participants in a balance that depended on timing, efficiency, and adaptation. Their success relied on the availability of prey, which in turn depended on the distribution of plant life, creating a sequence where each level influenced the next. Movement across the landscape often reflected this connection, with predators following pathways established by herbivores, and herbivores responding to the patterns of vegetation that supported them. These interactions formed a dynamic system where energy passed through successive stages, never remaining fixed in one place. Scavengers and decomposers completed this cycle, breaking down organic material and returning its components to the soil. This process ensured that nutrients did not remain locked within individual organisms, but re entered the environment where they could support further growth. Insects and microbial life played essential roles in this phase, working at scales that often went unnoticed yet carried lasting impact. Through their activity, the system maintained continuity, allowing energy to circulate rather than dissipate without renewal. The balance within these ecosystems did not imply stability in a fixed sense, but rather a continuous adjustment to changing conditions. Shifts in climate, availability of water, or the distribution of species could alter the flow of energy, creating periods where certain connections strengthened while others weakened. In some cases, these changes remained localized, affecting only specific regions, while in others, they extended more broadly, influencing larger portions of the landscape. This balance also carried an inherent fragility, as the removal or reduction of one component could influence the entire system. A decline in plant growth, for instance, would affect herbivores, which in turn would alter the presence of predators. These connections created a network where each part contributed to the functioning of the whole, and where changes could propagate through multiple levels. Yet within this fragility existed resilience, as systems adjusted and reorganized, forming new patterns that allowed life to continue under altered conditions. Across these environments, food chains did not operate as isolated sequences, but as interconnected pathways that overlapped and influenced one another. Energy flowed through multiple routes, creating a web of relationships that supported diversity while maintaining coherence. Each interaction, whether direct or indirect, contributed to the broader structure, shaping ecosystems that reflected both the constraints and opportunities of the world they inhabited. Across each passing cycle, life unfolded through patterns that repeated with subtle variation, shaped by the shifting balance between opportunity and limitation. Activity did not remain constant, but followed intervals where conditions allowed movement, feeding, and interaction, followed by periods where stillness offered greater advantage. In this rhythm, animals moved through their environment with an awareness that was not conscious in the human sense, yet deeply aligned with the signals carried by light, temperature, and the availability of resources. Feeding formed a central part of these daily patterns, guiding movement across the landscape in ways that reflected both abundance and scarcity. Herbivores followed the distribution of vegetation, moving between areas where growth persisted long enough to sustain them. Their grazing did not occur continuously, but in phases, often concentrated during intervals when conditions supported both activity and digestion. Predators, in turn, adjusted their behavior to these patterns, observing and responding to the movement of prey, aligning their own activity with moments when the balance of energy favored pursuit. Rest held equal importance, though it appeared less visible within the broader flow of activity. Animals sought locations that offered shelter from environmental extremes, selecting spaces that reduced exposure to heat, cold, or other pressures. These resting periods, allowed for recovery and conservation, maintaining the internal balance necessary for continued survival. The choice of where and when to rest reflected both immediate conditions and longer term patterns, forming part of a cycle that repeated across each day. Movement across larger distances introduced another layer to these patterns, as some species shifted their position over time in response to changing conditions. Migration did not always follow long, uninterrupted paths, but could occur in stages, guided by the gradual movement of resources across the landscape. Territory, in contrast, reflected a more localized approach, where individuals or groups maintained familiarity with specific areas, using knowledge of the environment to navigate challenges and locate essential resources. These two strategies often coexisted, with animals balancing the stability of known regions against the need to adjust to broader changes. Interactions between species formed a network of relationships that extended beyond direct encounters. Competition for resources influenced behavior, shaping how animals moved, fed, and established space. Predation introduced another dimension, creating a balance where both hunter and prey adapted continuously to one another's presence. These interactions were not isolated events, but part of a broader system where each action influenced others, contributing to a dynamic equilibrium that persisted across time. Survival within this framework required constant adjustment, as conditions rarely remained fixed. Variations in climate, availability of food, and the presence of other organisms introduced challenges that demanded flexibility. Some animals responded through behavioral shifts, altering their patterns of activity or movement, while others relied on physical adaptations that supported endurance under changing conditions. The ability to adjust rather than remain static became a defining feature of daily life. Through these interconnected patterns, animals moved within a world where each moment carried both constraint and possibility, forming a continuous sequence of actions that reflected the environment in which they lived. Their routines, though varied across species and regions, shared a common structure shaped by the balance between energy, opportunity, and the demands of survival. Standing within this ancient world, the differences would not announce themselves all at once, but would emerge gradually, revealed through the accumulation of details that diverged from what is known today. The land would feel continuous in a way that modern geography does not reflect, stretching outward without the interruptions that now divide continents. Horizons would carry a different sense of scale, shaped by a surface that connected distant regions into one extended form, where movement across the planet followed paths no longer possible in the present arrangement. Climate, too, would present itself through contrasts that unfolded across distance and time. Some regions would carry patterns that seem familiar, with cycles of warmth and cooler intervals, yet the consistency of these patterns would shift depending on location. In other areas, extremes would define the experience, with temperature and moisture varying more sharply than what is typically encountered today. The absence of certain moderating influences would allow these contrasts to persist, creating environments that felt both recognizable in principle and unfamiliar in their expression. Life within these settings would reinforce this sense of difference, offering forms that share structural similarities with modern organisms, yet lack many of the defining features now taken for granted. Forests would stand without the presence of flowering plants or grasses, altering the visual and structural composition of the landscape. Animals would move through these environments with body plans that hint at later developments, yet remain distinct in their proportions and behavior. The absence of birds in the sky and the quieter nature of plant life would further distinguish this world from the one that exists today. Despite these differences, certain elements would remain consistent, providing points of continuity that bridge the gap between past and present. The movement of water, whether across land or along coastlines, would follow patterns that still operate under the same physical principles. The cycles of light and darkness would continue to guide activity, shaping behavior in ways that remain recognizable. Even within unfamiliar ecosystems, the fundamental relationships between organisms, such as feeding, competition, and reproduction, would reflect processes that persist across time. The changes that separate this world from the present did not occur suddenly, but developed through a sequence of gradual transformations that unfolded over millions of years. The movement of continents altered the arrangement of land and sea, reshaping climate systems and influencing how energy moved across the planet. Atmospheric composition shifted as geological and biological processes interacted, adjusting the balance of gases that define environmental conditions. Evolution continued to refine and redirect the forms of life, introducing new groups while others declined or disappeared. Through these ongoing processes, the Earth moved from one configuration to another, each stage carrying its own set of characteristics that reflect the conditions of its time. The world of the Permian represents one of these stages, complete in its structure yet distinct from what followed. Its differences do not imply a lack of continuity, but rather a demonstration of the planet's capacity for change, where familiar principles persist even as their expression evolves into forms that no longer resemble those that came before. Seen from a broader span of time, this world becomes less a distant landscape and more a chapter within an ongoing process, where change unfolds not as disruption, but as a steady reconfiguration of systems that never remain fixed. The Permian does not stand apart as an isolated moment, but as part of a continuum in which environments shift, stabilize, and transform again, each phase shaped by forces that operate both at the surface and deep beneath it. Through this perspective, the planet reveals itself as something continuously in motion, even when its changes are too gradual to perceive within a single lifetime. Across this interval, the arrangement of land, the composition of the atmosphere, and the structure of ecosystems move together, influencing one another in ways that formed a tightly connected system. When continents merged, circulation patterns altered, redistributing heat and moisture across vast distances. These shifts, in turn, affected the organisms that depended on those conditions, guiding adaptation through both constraint and opportunity. Life did not remain separate from these changes, but responded to them, adjusting forms and behaviors in alignment with new realities. This interplay offers a clear understanding that stability on Earth is often temporary, defined by balance within a specific set of conditions rather than permanence. What appears steady at one moment may represent only a phase within a longer cycle where gradual shifts accumulate until the system takes on a new configuration. The Permian reflects such a phase, where equilibrium existed, yet carried within it the potential for further transformation. The absence of abrupt boundaries between these stages emphasizes the continuity of change, where transitions occur through progression rather than sudden replacement. Adaptation emerges within this context as both a response and a process that shapes future possibilities. Organisms adjust to existing conditions, yet in doing so, they influence the structure of ecosystems, contributing to the direction of subsequent changes. This reciprocal relationship between life and environment reinforces the idea that evolution is not merely reactive, but participates in the ongoing development of planetary systems. Each adaptation, while rooted in immediate necessity, becomes part of a broader pattern that extends beyond individual species. The Permian also illustrates how interconnected these systems remain, even across different scales. Geological processes, atmospheric composition, climate patterns, and biological activity operate together, forming networks where change in one component influences many others. This interconnectedness means that understanding any single aspect requires consideration of the whole, as each element contributes to a larger structure that defines the state of the planet at a given time. Through this lens, Earth appears not as a static environment, but as a dynamic system capable of occupying many different states while maintaining continuity in its underlying processes. The variations observed across its history demonstrate a capacity for transformation that extends far beyond immediate observation, revealing patterns that unfold over immense spans of time. The Permian stands within this sequence as a fully realized expression of those patterns, offering insight into how the planet evolves while remaining governed by the same fundamental principles. In observing this world, the lesson that emerges is one of continuity within change, where environments shift, life adapts, and the system as a whole moves forward through cycles that connect past, present, and future into a single, unbroken narrative. What remains at the end of this passage is not a sense of something incomplete, but the quiet recognition of a world that once functioned with its own balance, its own rhythms, and its own internal logic. Every system described, from the movement of air to the flow of energy through living networks, formed part of a structure that operated without pause, sustaining itself across immense spans of time. Nothing within it existed in isolation. Each element, whether visible or subtle, contributed to a broader coherence that allowed this version of Earth to persist as a fully realized environment. It is easy to view this distant world as unfamiliar, shaped by conditions that no longer define the present, yet it existed with the same level of complexity and stability that surrounds us now. The differences do not diminish its completeness, but instead highlight the range of forms the planet has been capable of supporting. Land, atmosphere, and life arranged themselves into patterns that, while distinct, followed principles that continue to operate. In this way, the Permian becomes less a strange exception and more an example of how flexible and responsive Earth has always been. Across time, the planet has moved through many such configurations, each one shaped by the gradual interplay of geological forces, atmospheric changes, and biological evolution. These shifts do not erase what came before, but build upon it, carrying traces of earlier systems into new arrangements. The present world reflects this accumulation, just as the Permian reflected the conditions that preceded it. Through this continuity, Earth reveals a capacity for transformation that extends far beyond any single moment. Within this perspective, the value of looking back becomes clear. Each past environment offers insight into how systems respond to change, how life adapts, and how balance is maintained even as conditions evolve. The Permian provides one of these insights, showing a world that operated under different constraints while remaining fully functional. Its existence reminds us that the planet does not move toward a fixed endpoint, but continues to shift, guided by processes that remain active today. As this journey settles, there is space to consider what stood out most within this landscape, whether it was the structure of its environments, the forms of life that inhabited them, or the subtle ways in which familiar processes appeared in unfamiliar forms. These impressions, carried forward, become part of an ongoing exploration where each reflection deepens the understanding of Earth's history. If this passage has held your attention, you are welcome to share what remained with you and to continue exploring the many chapters that shape our planet's story. Each layer of the past offers another view into the systems that define Earth, inviting a steady and thoughtful return to the worlds that came before.